Elvis was halfway through Love Me Tender when he noticed something in the third row that made him stop everything. A woman was crying, not from joy, but from heartbreak. Next to her sat a man with his wedding ring in his palm, ready to end their 15-year marriage right there in the arena. It was March 22, 1975, at the Sahara Tahoe in Nevada, and Elvis was performing the second show of what would become one of his most emotionally charged weekends. The venue was packed with 1,200 people, all expecting nothing more than an evening of classic Elvis entertainment. But sometimes life has other plans, and sometimes those plans intersect with moments that define not just an evening, but entire lives. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because we're bringing you the untold stories that reveal the true heart behind music's greatest legends. Sarah and Michael Davidson had been married for 15 years, but tonight felt like the end of everything they'd built together. They'd driven up from Los Angeles specifically for this Elvis show, not as a romantic getaway, but as what Sarah privately called their last hurrah, before filing divorce papers on Monday morning. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that they were ending their marriage while listening to love songs from the man who'd played at their wedding reception back in 1960. Michael, a 42-year-old insurance adjuster, had been carrying his wedding ring loose in his pocket for 3 weeks now, unable to bring himself to take it off completely but unwilling to pretend their marriage still meant something. Sarah, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher, had stopped wearing hers entirely after discovering the extent of Michael's emotional distance and what she perceived as his complete disengagement from their life together. The problems hadn't started suddenly. Like most marriage failures, theirs had been a gradual erosion of connection, communication, and care. Michael had become increasingly consumed by work pressures, bringing home the stress of quotas and difficult clients until he had nothing left to give to his wife. Sarah had responded by throwing herself into her teaching career and community volunteer work, finding fulfillment outside their relationship since she couldn't find it within it. They'd stopped talking about anything meaningful months ago. Their conversations had devolved into logistics about bills, schedules, and household maintenance. They'd stopped touching each other casually, stopped laughing together, stopped sharing their daily experiences and concerns. They were living like polite roommates rather than married partners, and both of them knew it. They'd been to counseling, they'd tried separation, they'd attempted everything their pastor had recommended.
Marry me, darling?
Nothing had worked.
Yes, oh yes.
Dr. Patricia Hensley, their marriage counselor, had told them during their final session 3 weeks earlier that sometimes the kindest thing two people can do is acknowledge when a relationship has run its course. Those words had given them permission to stop fighting for something that felt impossible to save. Elvis's intervention that night wasn't just a moment of spontaneous kindness, it was the culmination of his own journey through love, loss, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from making mistakes and learning from them. Just 2 years earlier, Elvis had finalized his own divorce from Priscilla, a process that had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about commitment, communication, and what it really means to fight for someone you love. The months following his divorce had been some of the darkest of Elvis's life, not because he didn't understand why the marriage ended, but because he'd begun to see patterns in his own behavior that had contributed to its failure. He'd thrown himself into work, into performing, into anything that would keep him from sitting alone with the knowledge that he'd let his own fears and insecurities sabotage the most important relationship of his life. That's why, when he saw Sarah and Michael Davidson in the third row that March night, he recognized something familiar in their body language, in the way they sat so close together yet seemed miles apart. He saw the same resignation he'd felt in his own marriage's final months, the same sense of defeat that comes when two people who once couldn't imagine life without each other suddenly can't imagine how to make it work with each other. As Elvis crooned the familiar words of "Love Me Tender," Sarah found herself overwhelmed not by nostalgia, but by the crushing weight of failure. Here they were, listening to the song that had been their wedding dance, and all she could think about was how thoroughly they destroyed what had once seemed unbreakable. She began crying quietly, trying not to disturb the other concertgoers, but the tears came harder than she'd expected. Michael, caught between his own grief and his inability to comfort his wife, made a decision that would change the trajectory of their evening in ways he couldn't imagine. He pulled the wedding ring from his pocket and placed it deliberately on the small table in front of them, next to their untouched drinks. It was his way of saying what words had failed to express for months: this was over. Sarah saw the ring sitting there like a discarded promise, and her quiet crying became audible sobbing. She wasn't trying to make a scene, but 15 years of accumulated disappointment and lost dreams don't stay quiet when they finally break free. The gesture felt like a final rejection, confirmation that Michael was as ready to abandon their marriage as she feared. The couple sitting next to them, celebrating their own anniversary, exchanged uncomfortable glances and tried to give them privacy while still enjoying the show. But Sarah's crying was becoming impossible to ignore, and other patrons were beginning to notice the disturbance in the third row. Elvis, despite being focused on his performance and the bright stage lights that typically made it difficult to see individual audience members, noticed the disturbance in the third row. Something about the woman's posture, the way the man had pulled away from her, and the visible tension between them caught his attention in a way that transcended his usual performer-audience relationship. He'd been performing for over 20 years, had seen every type of audience reaction imaginable, but something about this couple's pain spoke to him on a level that went beyond entertainment. Maybe it was his own recent experience with divorce, maybe it was the way their grief seemed to echo in the lyrics he was singing, but Elvis found himself unable to look away from their table. What happened next had never occurred in Elvis Presley's career, and would never happen again. He stopped singing mid-verse, holding up a hand to signal his band to stop playing. The sudden silence in the room was deafening. 1,200 people turned their attention from the stage to whatever had captured Elvis's focus, and then to each other, wondering if they were witnessing some kind of medical emergency or technical malfunction. "Folks, I need your patience for just a moment," Elvis said into his microphone, his voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and gentleness that had made him famous. "I'm seeing something down here that's more important than any song I could sing tonight." He walked to the edge of the stage, squinting slightly against the lights to get a better look at Sarah and Michael. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice now carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. Sarah looked up, mortified that her private moment of grief had become a public spectacle. "I'm sorry," she managed to say, her voice barely audible even with Elvis's microphone picking it up. "I didn't mean to interrupt your show." "You didn't interrupt anything, honey," Elvis replied, his tone warm and reassuring. "But I can see you're hurting, and that makes it my business. What's that ring doing on the table there?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Michael, feeling exposed and defensive, started to stand up, perhaps planning to leave, but Elvis raised his hand gently. "Now hold on there, partner. I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. I'm just wondering if maybe we can't help each other out here." As Elvis made his way through the crowd toward the Davidsons' table, several thoughts raced through his mind. He was violating every principle of professional performance, risking his reputation on a whim, potentially embarrassing these strangers in front of hundreds of people. But something deeper than professional caution was driving him, a recognition that he'd been given a platform not just to entertain, but to make a difference when it mattered most. Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, was frantically gesturing from the wings for Elvis to return to the stage and continue the show, but Elvis ignored him completely. This moment felt more important than any contract or professional obligation. Sarah Davidson, watching this famous man approach their table, felt a mix of mortification and desperate hope. She'd grown up listening to Elvis's music, had danced to "Love Me Tender" at her wedding, had played his albums during the early years of her marriage when she and Michael would slow dance in their tiny apartment kitchen. Now here he was, witnessing the end of everything those songs had once represented. Elvis did something then that shocked everyone in the venue, including his own band members who'd been with him for years. He set down his microphone, walked off the stage, and made his way directly to Sarah and Michael's table. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the king of rock and roll pulled up a chair and sat down with two strangers in the middle of his own concert. "My name's Elvis," he said quietly, extending his hand to Michael, who shook it mechanically. And I'm guessing you two are having what my mama used to call, a crisis of the heart. Sarah was still crying, but now it was mixed with disbelief at the surreal nature of what was happening. We're getting divorced, she said simply, as if that explained everything. I figured as much, Elvis replied. Been married long? 15 years, Michael answered, his voice tight with emotion he'd been suppressing for months. Elvis picked up the wedding ring from the table, examining it in the dim lighting of the venue. This is a nice ring. Good weight to it. Bet it cost you a pretty penny back when you bought it. Michael nodded. Took me 6 months to save up for it. And I bet when you put it on her finger the first time, you meant every word you said about forever and always and all that, Elvis continued, looking back and forth between them. We both did, Sarah whispered. Elvis was quiet for a moment, and 1,200 people watched him think. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more personal, less performative. You know, I've been married, and I've been divorced, and I've made more mistakes in love than I care to count. But I'll tell you something I learned the hard way, most of the time when we think a marriage is over, what's really over is our willingness to fight for it. The conversation that followed would later be remembered by witnesses as one of the most raw, honest exchanges they'd ever heard between strangers. Elvis, speaking without his usual performative charm, talked about the specific ways he'd failed in his own marriage, his inability to be present even when he was home, his tendency to avoid difficult conversations, his assumption that love alone was enough to sustain a relationship without the daily work of understanding and compromise. You know, Elvis said quietly, his voice barely carrying to the nearest tables, I can tell you two love each other. It's written all over both of you, even now, even angry and hurt as you are. Sarah looked up through her tears. How can you possibly know that? Because people who don't love each other don't hurt this much when it's ending, Elvis replied. Indifference doesn't cry. Indifference doesn't carry wedding rings in pockets for weeks, afraid to take them off completely. Michael's head snapped up. He'd told no one about carrying the ring loose, not their counselor, not his brother, not even Sarah herself. Elvis noticed his reaction. I know because I did the same thing, son. Carried mine around for 3 months after my divorce was final, telling myself I was keeping it for sentimental value but really keeping it because throwing it away felt like admitting I'd failed at the most important thing I'd ever tried to do. What Elvis did next became the stuff of Las Vegas legend. He stood up, helped Sarah to her feet, and guided both of them toward the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to the crowd, I want you to meet Sarah and Michael Davidson. They've been married for 15 years, and they're here tonight because they think their story is over. But I think maybe we can help them write a different ending. The crowd erupted in applause, but Elvis raised his hand for quiet. Now, I'm not a preacher, and I'm not a marriage counselor, but I am a man who believes in second chances. Michael, I want you to take this ring and put it back where it belongs. And Sarah, I want you to remember why you said yes to this man 15 years ago. Michael took the ring with shaking hands. For the first time in months, he really looked at his wife, not at her flaws, not at their problems, but at the woman he'd fallen in love with. Sarah, he said, his voice breaking, I know I've been a terrible husband lately. I know I've let you down in ways I can't even count. But I don't want this to be over. I want to fight for us. Sarah looked at the ring, then at Michael, then at Elvis, who was watching them with the kind of gentle intensity that made it impossible to lie or hide. I want to fight too, she said. I'm scared we've broken too much to fix, but I want to try. Michael slipped the ring back onto Sarah's finger, and 1,200 strangers cheered like they'd just witnessed something sacred. Elvis put his arms around both of them and said, that's what I call a good start. But Elvis wasn't finished. He invited them to stay on stage for the rest of the show, dedicating every love song to their renewed commitment to each other. When he sang, Can't Help Falling in Love, he had Michael and Sarah slow dance on stage while the audience sang along softly, turning the entire venue into an intimate celebration of second chances. What followed was not just a renewal of vows, but a complete reimagining of what their marriage could become. Elvis had them slow dance to Love Me Tender, while he sang it a cappella, his voice softer and more intimate than anyone in the venue had ever heard it. The entire audience joined in singing the chorus, creating a moment of communal support for two people who thought they were completely alone in their struggle. The evening ended with Elvis giving them his personal phone number and an invitation to call him if they ever needed someone to remind them that love is worth fighting for. He also arranged for them to have a weekend at his expense at a couple's retreat in Arizona, telling them that sometimes you have to go away together to remember why you came together in the first place. But Elvis's intervention didn't end that night. True to his word, he stayed in touch with the Davidsons for years afterward, calling them on their anniversaries, sending cards when they faced difficult times, and even visiting them when he was performing in Los Angeles. He became not just the man who saved their marriage, but a lifelong friend who reminded them, whenever they needed it, that love is always worth fighting for. Sarah and Michael Davidson returned to Los Angeles with more than just renewed vows, they returned with a story that would define the rest of their marriage. They never did file those divorce papers. Instead, they spent the next 32 years of their marriage telling anyone who would listen about the night Elvis Presley saved their relationship by refusing to let them give up on each other. When they returned home, they made changes that went far beyond typical marriage advice. They established new rituals, a daily 10-minute conversation where they shared something they appreciated about each other, a weekly date where they took turns planning something the other person would enjoy, and a monthly, State of the Union, discussion where they honestly assessed how they were doing as individuals and as a couple. More importantly, they became advocates for other struggling couples. They started volunteering at their church's marriage ministry, sharing their story and the lessons they'd learned from Elvis about the daily choice to love someone even when it's difficult. They helped dozens of other couples find their way back to each other, always crediting Elvis with showing them that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let people give up on something worth saving. When Michael passed away in 2007, Sarah told the pastor at his funeral that her husband had lived every day since that March night in 1975 trying to be worthy of the second chance Elvis had helped them find. The wedding ring that had sat discarded on a table in Lake Tahoe was buried with him, and Sarah kept a photo from that night, a Polaroid someone in the audience had taken of her and Michael dancing on stage with Elvis, on her bedside table until her own death in 2015. The story of Elvis and the Davidsons became a touchstone for anyone who'd ever wondered if a broken relationship could truly be repaired. It proved that sometimes the most profound healing happens not in private therapy sessions or self-help books, but in moments of unexpected grace when someone with the power to help chooses to use that power in service of love. Have you ever experienced a moment when a stranger's kindness completely changed your perspective on what you thought was impossible to fix? Sometimes it takes someone from outside our situation to help us see what we're about to lose and why it's worth saving. The story of Elvis and the Davidsons reminds us that love isn't just about the feelings we have for each other, it's about the choice we make every day to keep fighting for those feelings, even when everything seems broken beyond repair. Elvis could have ignored their pain, could have continued with his show, could have let them work out their problems privately. Instead, he chose to use his platform, his influence, and his own hard-earned wisdom about love and loss to give two people the push they needed to try one more time. This incredible story shows us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply refuse to let people give up on something worth saving, even when they've convinced themselves it's over.